We cannot afford to continue this level of income and wealth inequality, and we cannot afford a billionaire class whose greed and corruption has been at war with the working families of this country for 45 years. The way you win an election in this time in history is not the same old, same old. You have to inspire people. You have to excite people.
Senator.
That is why we need a political revolution that says enough is enough to this behavior.
Bernie Sanders ran one of the most radically progressive political campaigns in recent history. Sanders, a self-described democratic socialist, has criticized America's capitalist economy for failing to meet people's basic human needs, such as healthcare. America has a long history of radical left political movements, particularly in marginalized minority communities. For instance, the Black Panthers, born out of the civil rights movement, who believed in working towards economic independence for African Americans.
That I was a communist because I feel that this is the only way in which we are going to ultimately liberate ourselves as black people.
However, these political movements are already taught in America's education system and at times demonized, in part due to the hostility towards far-left ideologies cultivated during the Cold War. Leaders of past leftist movements which have gone overlooked include the Mexican-American socialists, communists, and anarchists embedded deep within the Chicano movement. These radical Chicanos in the bodies of the Southwest would influence the broader American labor movement and contribute to many of the labor and civil protections Mexican-American workers enjoy to this day. Mexican-American leftists will not only be the voice of the Chicano movement, but lay the groundwork for the movement itself. Throughout the 1900s, people of Mexican descent were subject to racial and economic discrimination under the American government, allowing big businesses and rich white international investors to exploit the Mexican labor force for large profits on a daily basis. Mexican-American workers experienced cruel conditions under a racist, hyper-capitalist American government. As a result, many workers were radicalized to far-left ideologies which advocated for a reorganization of the economy to benefit workers. During the Chicano movement, radicals equipped with far-left ideologies articulated the struggles and goals of the Mexican-American working class, establishing a class consciousness among Mexican Americans. Nowadays, the terms liberal and leftist are used interchangeably, but they actually mean very different things. To understand far-left political ideologies, such as socialism or anarchism, one must first understand capitalism. Far-left ideologies stem from critiques of capitalism and ultimately reject capitalism in its entirety. Economists define capitalism as the means of production being privately owned, meaning anything that accumulates wealth, money, in society is privately owned, either by an individual or a collection of individuals, sometimes referred to as a corporation. This includes farms, businesses, and natural resources like oil. Capitalism also entails the tradings of goods and services in free markets, where consumer demand is met by private supply. Another key component of capitalism is the maximization of profit. Liberals are people whose beliefs can be categorized under liberalism, and generally believe that capitalism and its profits can provide the best outcomes for society and individual happiness. For example, many consider Adam Smith to be the father of modern economics and liberal values. Leftists are people who hold anti-capitalist views. Leftists believe that a capitalist economy will always fail to meet people's needs, and thus call for reorganizing the economy to prioritize societal needs over profits by having workers collectively own the means of production rather than a few owners. Core principles of leftist ideologies include equality, specifically economic equality, collectivism, as well as democracy in the workplace and the economy, and the eventual transition away from capitalism. One such leftist was Karl Marx. Marx was a 19th century German philosopher, economist, sociologist, and held many more impressive titles. Marx lived through the peak of the Industrial Revolution and witnessed the rapid growth of capitalism and its consequences. Marx wrote multiple very big and very boring books about economics. However, Marx is most famously known for the Communist Manifesto. In a 23-page pamphlet that was distributed to the working class and poor of his day, Marx outlined his view of society as historically a class struggle between laborers and owners, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, as Marx called it in his day. In his manifesto, Marx called on the workers to rise up and seize control of private industry. The terms socialism and communism were used interchangeably by Marx in the manifesto to describe the seizing of the means and mode of production by workers. Leftist doctrines like Marx's Communist Manifesto circulated throughout the Mexican public, drastically reshaping political and labor activism in Mexico. Eventually, radical left ideologies like socialism, communism, and anarchism would spread throughout a disenfranchised labor movement occurring in Mexico in the second half of the 19th century. Mass migration from Mexico to the US occurred in the early 1900s as a consequence of the destabilization of Mexico's economy during and after the Mexican Revolution. Mexicans in seek of work and a better life crossed the American border by the thousands. Among the thousands of immigrants crossing the US border were hundreds of radicalized workers who kept with them socialist traditions, ideas, and doctrines. Far left anti-capitalist ideologies rooted deep within the Mexican labor force would immigrate to the United States along with the workers. Socialists and communists soon began re-emerging in the U.S. Mexican-American labor force and began organizing work strikes, unions, and anti-capitalist media. For example, a Mexican-American leftist newspaper by the name of El Defensor del Obrero circulated throughout Mexican laborers in the booming railroad industry of the Southwest around 1910. Mexican railroad workers were left without the support of unions since it was legal for unions to discriminate on race, and many did. In addition to the harsh working conditions that Mexican workers faced while constructing the track, Mexican Americans were forced to work for less money than their white counterparts. According to Professor Chacon, the editors of El Defensa de Obra used a socialist analysis to challenge machismo and appeal for unity between working class men and women. Mexican leftist efforts in the railroad industry led to some of the very first Mexican American unions in America. Mexican American labor movements would continue to gain momentum throughout the Southwest, and in the late 1960s to early 1970s, Mexican American civil rights and economic movements would culminate into what is now known as the Chicano movement. Broadly speaking, the Chicano movement was an organized effort by Mexican Americans to advocate for social and economic justice. Mexican American agricultural workers and other laborers, students, artists, and feminist leaders declared the Mexican American community had been exploited long enough. These Mexican Americans would often refer to themselves as Chicanos. Although the movement happened primarily in the Southwest, there were many Chicano labor strikes and protests across the nation. The core message of the Chicano movement was that in order to gain economic independence and civil rights, Mexican American communities and workers needed to come together as a whole. The term Aztlan was also used by influencers of the movement like Rodolfo Jorge Gonzalez to describe the mythical ancestral homeland of Mexican Americans which they sought to restore. Revolutionary Marxist Che Guevara became a common symbol of anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist rebellion within the Chicano movement. Che Guevara's successful communist revolution in Cuba inspired many Mexican Americans across the sea to advocate for a similar solution.
Hasta conquistar la verdadera independencia por la que ya han muerto más de una vez inútilmente. Ahora, en todo caso, los que mueran morirán como los de Cuba, los de Playa Girón, morirán por su única, verdadera, irrenunciable independencia.
Che Guevara's impassioned speeches, which radicalized the working poor of Cuba to take up arms, would also radicalize the working poor in the fields of California. Desperate circumstances in which many workers found themselves in led them to compassionate, charismatic figures such as Che Guevara, who offered solutions to their economic distress. The Brown Berets were one such group that adopted Che Guevara's philosophy as their own. Many Berets held radical left politics and were outspoken Marxists/communists, similar to the Black Panthers, through which the Brown Berets were modeled after, not only in terms of how the Panthers viewed economic liberation for their race, but also in how they organized and protested. At the height of the Chicano Revolution, the leftist tradition of mass distribution of anti-capitalist media to grow class consciousness among workers, which was practiced by radical leftists in early Mexico, resurfaced. Most popular among these papers was La Casa, ran by the Brown Berets themselves. La Casa would inform Chicano communities about police brutality against Mexican Americans that was not covered by mainstream media, as well as student and worker walkouts. Far-left politics were of course prevalent in the paper. For instance, many anti-war articles protesting the Vietnam War condemned capitalism as the root cause. U.S. intervention in Vietnam, as the Brown Berets saw, was a war solely motivated by a profit-driven system at the expense of Chicano lives. According to John Lorenzo, who holds a Master of Arts in Ethnic Studies, they wanted their brothers and sisters to understand that what they should be focusing their anger and energy on was ways to find how to defeat a system that was imperialistic in nature, racist, capitalistic, and to take it down. It was not enough to reform certain aspects of society that held their community down, but to destroy the entire system and create a new way of life for the betterment of all people of color. Race integration and slow economic reform was no longer an option for the Chicano community in the eyes of the Brown Berets. For the nation of Aztlan, the Brown Berets became an extremist, nationalist organization. The Chicano movement's core economic principles are deeply rooted in leftist ideology. Long before the Chicano Revolution, radical leftists permeated the Mexican working class with ideas of economic freedom and prosperity. As Mario Garcia, a professor of Chicano studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, explains, militant Chicano historians look to a radical past to legitimize the emergence of a contemporary Chicano protest movement. These Chicano historians gained access to the academy as a result of class struggle, which became embedded in their scholarship. In doing so, they consciously rejected the conventional anti-communism of McCarthyism that sterilized academia over the previous generation to inoculate against independent and radical academic endeavors not in line with prevailing Cold War conventions. Looking back on the Mexican American community's history with far-left politics is necessary to understand how the Chicano Revolution came to be. Chicanismo, the word historians use to describe the Chicano movement's ideology, is the culmination of hundreds of years of radical left labor movements in Mexican American history. Without the effort Mexican radicals in the barrios took in educating laborers, forming unions, organizing work strikes, and distributing counter media, the Chicano movement may have never even come to fruition.